Well, during Tuesday's Bradfield oration just yesterday, leaders of both the major parties in New South Wales were given the opportunity to lay out their vision for the future of the state. As Premier Dominic Perrottet focused his pitch on the state's education sector, the opposition leader Chris Minns chose to draw battle lines through the middle of the city, perhaps. He pointed to disproportionate housing and public transport infrastructure for Western Sydney. It does signal that Labor intends to campaign for key Western Sydney seats, but let's get to it now. We'll confirm it perhaps with Chris Minns. He joins us live now, the New South Wales opposition leader. Good to see you. Look, it's always great to get a more forthright, longer-term vision. You know, politicians often get accused of short-term politics and day-to-day things, but we got vision from both of you yesterday. I'm interested in this housing plan because I reckon it's on everyone's minds, not just in New South Wales at the moment, but right around the country as we can see the cost of everything. Let's talk about where you want to build new houses. Where are you going to release this public land in the east and the north for public housing?
Well, there is a lot of land, Laura, on public transport corridors. Both the opposition and the government have identified that land. The government's currently holding it in the Transport Asset Holding Entity, and there is a proposal to release part of it to increase the supply of housing for New South Wales, and in particular supply affordable housing as well as key worker housing for teachers and nurses closer to city infrastructure and transport infrastructure. Now, the government's plan would see hotels built on a lot of those proposals and lots. New South Wales Labor want to make sure we increase the supply of housing, particularly close to the eastern seaboard.
Where are those areas? So where does the current government want to build these hotels in the east and north shore where you want to build housing? Can you identify the exact areas?
Yeah, they're often abutted to transport corridors. In some cases, they're the airspace above transport corridors. In many cases, they're lands adjacent to the existing transport infrastructure in New South Wales. You see jurisdictions around the world, particularly Transport for London, which has got a big property arm that in fact builds and develops on transport corridors in London as a key source of housing supply for that organisation, that community and that city in London. We can do the same in New South Wales, and indeed the government has already identified options and opportunities to do that. We'd like to see it transferred and made more available for key worker housing and affordable housing in Sydney.
I'm just trying to work out exactly where these areas are, though, because yesterday in your speech you talked about Mossman,
I'll give you an example.
Okay, thank you.
No, absolutely. So Crow's Nest is a great example. Crow's Nest station, above that was a 24-storey tower or building was proposed to be put on top of the metro station for the North West Metro. It was a key part of the compact that really provided the financing for that key piece of transport infrastructure. The New South Wales government knocked that proposal off, and as a result, 24 stories of supply for the Sydney housing market was taken off the agenda. And as a result, I think everyone needs to draw all of our attention to the fact that there's a net sum gain here. If you don't build closer to the city and key pieces of transport infrastructure, it will go west. So you're seeing Parramatta with an increase of 127,000 people, Blacktown 110,000, the Hills 100,000, Camden 80,000, whereas areas closer to the city where most of the transport infrastructure is being built have got paltry sums and paltry increases. OK,
so when you're talking about more social housing, though, and you say it wasn't just Lane Cove, it was Crow's Nest, Willara, as I mentioned, are you talking about apartments? So if you want social, affordable housing close to the city now, is it really just apartments?
Absolutely. Of course we need to build apartments closer to the city.
But we're talking about families and not giving up on that, you know, great Australian dream of owning a home. But are you now saying, you know, if the New South Wales, under your leadership, is going to build more social housing, you're going to have to get used to the idea of families living in apartments?
Look, as part of the housing mix, of course, apartments need to be part of the housing mix for New South Wales. This is particularly important in terms of intergenerational equity. The average apartment price has doubled in the last 10 years, which means young people can't get their feet on the housing ladder and in many cases can't even rent a slice of Sydney. And as a result, when it comes to teachers and nurses and police officers and paramedics. They're not able to live and work in Sydney. And if they are, it's normally on the western fringe of Sydney. And as a result, hours from employment centres as well as public transport infrastructure. My argument, I don't think it's that outrageous, is to say it needs to be rebalanced. I mean, the government attacked Labor for suggesting more infill closer to the city yesterday. I think that's a little bit like the mayor of New York City saying we're not going to have any new buildings in Manhattan. Of course you can have urban density in a city like Sydney, and I'd argue that it's essential.
I know, but if you're talking about the eastern suburbs of Sydney, I mean, if you live there, you're trying to figure out where this public land is. And if you're talking about building up, I mean, there's a lot of restrictions in the councils. You can't build up in these areas. So are you talking about perhaps considering, you know, parks? Or I'm just trying to figure out where this public land in the eastern suburbs is.
Well, I mean, the key point here is the announcement yesterday was using the Greater Sydney Commission to rebalance development along metro lines. Now, the metro doesn't extend into the eastern suburbs of Sydney, but it does extend through the harbour and up through the northwest. Now, if you look at the distribution of housing along that, well, this is an important point, Laura. If you look at the distribution of housing along that transport line, it was meant to see greater densities closer to the CBD, but the exact opposite thing happened. We're seeing more population increases in areas with less access to public transport and less population increases with a major increase in public transport. I want to tell your viewers this, $65 billion worth of metro public transport infrastructure is being built, the majority of which is east of Parramatta, but most of the population growth is west of Parramatta. So aligning population growth with transport infrastructure, I don't think is a radical idea. And in fact, I think it's the only way Sydney can grow. No,
it's not radical, but perhaps I'm just trying to get to the practicalities of it. 6% of housing in Blacktown is high density compared with 48% already in places like Wallara, just for an example. So if you're looking at, you know, long-term vision, and people getting into the housing market, isn't it better to build those homes on a little bit of land, a little bit further out from Sydney and commit to improving the infrastructure? Isn't that the better balance?
Well, a couple of things here is, firstly, it is out of balance. You're not seeing a fair distribution of population growth throughout the Sydney metropolitan area.
Yeah, but isn't
We're
that
not
obvious?
suggesting
because
the eastern
there's
suburbs.
No land left in some of these
I don't
areas.
think it is. I don't think it is. If you look at the growth of Barcelona, Paris, London, New York, infill development and urban consolidation, and that does mean more density along transport lines, is part of their vision for a growing city. It's really important to note, in Sydney today, that is not part of the vision as far as the Liberals are concerned. And the key reason for that, Laura, is because the TL challenge from independents for Liberal MPs has seen them say, we don't want development in our communities, we're going to push it all out into the western suburbs.
Right.
So when I go to Gregory Hills and there's 5,000 people... But isn't it fair? Don't you think that the distribution of population should be based on access to infrastructure? I mean, Gregory Hills, for example, 5,000 people move in, 6,000 people move into Gledswoods Hills. Most of them are young families. There's no public high school. I mean, how is that a reasonable distribution of population for Sydney when you want to have a growing Sydney and you want people to come in?
In the eastern suburbs. I mean, it's the same problems here. But when you're talking about the cost of land, the fact is that the taxpayer is going to be paying a lot more for a lot less land in the eastern suburbs than it is, you know, further out of Sydney. That's just a reality of it.
Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. The Committee for Sydney estimates that it's $100,000 less to have urban consolidation because you don't have to stretch social infrastructure over a greater plane of land. So, for example, Laura, if we keep sprawling Sydney the way the Liberal Party currently augmenting population growth for Sydney, you'll have to build a Westmead 2.0, a Westmead 3.0, a Westmead 4.0 because the western fringe of Sydney will keep expanding. Now, that's not the way Sydney should grow. In all fairness, that's not the way Brisbane or Melbourne or Auckland are growing. But because of the peculiarities of the politics affecting the Liberal Party, that's what we have to live with here. Now, I'm not saying that the eastern suburbs or the lower North Shore or the inner west should take more than their fair share, but there's got to be a fair distribution here.
OK, so is it fair to say the Liberals want to go out and you want to go up?
urban consolidation and a fair deal for all of Sydney is exactly what we need, and particularly when you consider all of that transport infrastructure has been built closer to the city. If we want to have teachers and nurses and firefighters and police officers close to where jobs and infrastructure are, then you have to make sure that you've got urban infill, and that means units closer to the eastern seaboard.
Right, so that is the thing. It changes life as we know it for many families as well. My parents' generation grew up in homes or semis. You're saying that if you want to live close to the city, get used to apartment and high-rise living.
Well, that's the case for many people today. I mean, in my own electorate of Cogra, we have street meetings more often than not. People, particularly young people, live in units and apartments and are happy to do so. That we need to make sure that we're building the communities that work for them so that there is open space, that you do use land use appropriately, that you are focusing on green spaces and recreational areas. But I don't know. I mean, you go around the world, when people come back to Sydney, they always seem to say, how come planning works so much better in New York and London and Paris, and how come we keep getting it wrong right here in Sydney? And I think the answer is because we don't have a fair distribution.
Councils are an issue?
Look, there's many issues with the planning system, but it all starts at the top, and this is an agenda from the Liberal Party. And look, there's an election season on. People need to know what the different parties' agendas are.
I don't know about that. Some councils are run by the Greens. But anyway, I digress. I quickly want to ask you about health data that's dropped today before we run out of time. It shows that wait times, 1 in 10 critically ill patients had to wait 10 minutes for an ambulance in New South Wales. That seems pretty good, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, those numbers are at record highs, and in many cases you're looking at people who have to wait a significant amount of time who are in the worst case scenario, or the most dire straits. Now, obviously, if the average wait time is increasing, it means that on the extremes, people are waiting for significant periods of time to get urgent access to medical treatment. This is not just a matter of increasing the number of paramedics, although that is part of our plan. It's also making sure we don't have bed block at emergency departments. Now, we recognise there's a real issue here. We need to make sure that we're investing in that interface between where the ambulances pull up and where they're treated and triaged at the emergency department. But the mix is wrong at the moment, and we're seeing some of the worst data we've ever seen when it comes to health information. OK.
Chris Minns, long chat today. Good to talk to you. We'll do it again soon.
Thanks, Laura.